Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the American Library in Paris. And thank you for braving the rain and coming to Evenings with an Author tonight, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. My name is Mayanne Wright, and I'm the docent here at the library, and I help out with the evening programs. How many of you are brand new to the American Library in Paris? Raise your hand, please. Yay, it's good to see you. It's good to see you. Well, the American Library in Paris is the largest English language lending library on the European continent. And we're over 100 years old. It's pretty astounding. And tonight we're very excited to have these wonderful culinary experts and food writers with us. So we have Jane Bertch here. This is Rosa Jackson, and this is Alexander Lobrano. And tonight they'll be talking about Jane's book, The French Ingredient, which is a memoir, and Rosa's new cookbook, which is called Niçoise, which explores the beauty and bounty of food in the Nice region. The conversation will take about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from you, the audience. So let me tell you a little bit about our guests here. Rosa Jackson, this is Rosa, has lived in Nice since 2004 and has operated her cooking school, Les Petits Farcis, for 20 years. She also has written about French food for international publications, including the Financial Times and Food and Wine. She runs the Paris food tour company, Edible Paris. Jane Bertch has spent more than 2 decades living and working in Europe. In 2009, she started La Cuisine Paris, which has become don't make fun of me. Let's see, the largest. Apropos. I know, it's very apropos. Let's see, now I've lost my place. Nonprofessional culinary school in France. She holds a BA in English, an MA in Labor and Industrial Relations from the University of Illinois, and an executive MA from the French Business School INSEAD. The French Ingredient is her first book. Alexander Lobrano lived in Boston, New York, and London before moving to Paris in 1986. As a food and travel writer, he has worked as Paris correspondent for Travel and Leisure, Departures Magazine, Gourmet Magazine. He's the author of the books Hungry for Paris, Hungry for France, and My Place at the Table, a recipe for a delicious life in Paris. He regularly contributes to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, France Today, and other publications. He is also a contributing writer at Air Mail News. Would you please join me in a warm welcome for our wonderful speakers here tonight. Thank you.
Okay, away we go. But very quickly, first of all, I just want to say that it's a huge pleasure for the three of us to be in the American Library because the library is so supportive of authors like ourselves, and I'm thrilled for both Jane and Rosa to be able to do this tonight because I think this is one of the best crowds in town anywhere in Paris tonight because we're united by 3 things. We love to read, we like good food, and France. So, we have a lot in common, and I think that both of these books are spectacularly wonderful books. I've known Rosa for a very long time. We've worked together in the past several times. I know Jane more recently, and I have just the most huge respect for both of what they've accomplished. And I'm just glad for them, too, that we're able to be on stage tonight. When my book came out a few years ago, it was back in COVID days, so it was all Zoom. But the library was hugely supportive of us, and so thanks so much for being here tonight. So I want to say, first off, I'll start with Rosa because we've known each other for such a long time. And Rosa runs a cooking school, as was mentioned, in Nice, Les Petits Farcis, that I've done several times. and it is unbelievably spectacular. Just FYI, both of these cooking schools make life easy on yourselves. I'm not a huckster by and large, but you can buy gift certificates to both of the cooking schools, and for friends who like to cook, that would be a pretty cool present. But I'm just interested to know, when did this idea first germinate, Rosa?
For the cooking school?
For the cooking school and the book.
Yeah, so as you know, I had been a journalist in Paris, and we worked together at Time Out, and I started doing food tours in Paris. So I love taking people around the markets. It's something that just came very naturally to me because I love sharing my pleasure at being at the markets. So after doing that in Paris, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to cook with the people after taking them to the market? But in Paris, I had a tiny little kitchen, like most people in Paris, and it was not feasible to bring people to my house. So I started working with a woman named Paul Kaya, who taught cooking in her home. And she became a bit my mentor for teaching cooking. But I had also worked at the Cordon Bleu many years ago when I first moved to Paris. So I had the experience of being in front of people and translating the classes from French to English. And I picked up a lot of tips from those chefs in that time. And I had been going to Nice very often for vacations. I had friends there. And something about the Mediterranean really, really appealed to me. And because I love, the colors of the markets, there's no more colorful market, I think, than in Nice. And I thought, that's where I want to do my cooking classes. And I mean, I could talk for an hour, so one thing led to another. But the idea itself came on a train. I was sitting on a TGV, and I was just looking out the window, as you do, and that's when it just popped into my head, like the name of my classes, and that I was really going to do it in Nice.
It's a long way from Rosa is Canadian and from Western Canada. So the Mediterranean is a very long way from where you first started.
Maybe that's why. And in my book, I mentioned that we had this cookie when I was growing up called the Nice biscuit. And it came, I don't know if any of you remember it. It came in a package that had palm trees on it. And for me, it was the most exotic thing, like palm trees, And I still look at palm trees every day in Nice. I'm like, I can't believe it,
I actually did. Well, you did.
Yes.
And what about you, Jane? I mean, when you had a very accomplished, you worked as a banker in the UK, then you moved here, you worked in finance here in France. What caused you to transition? What was the spark, or what was the genesis of your transition? And you're not transitioning. You transitioned from being a banker to a cooking school owner.
Yes. Has anybody read Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert? A few people. Well, that's how I'm going to answer that question. And if you haven't read it, I do encourage you to pick it up. To make a long story short, I was at a very difficult time in my life, and I'd spent my whole career clawing my way through the ranks of a bank. And at one point, I looked around and I thought, I don't belong here. And that's quite a scary feeling. And there were also family things going on, and I was pretty discontent, and I didn't know what was meant for me. So I think the best thing you can do when you're in that situation is allow yourself to dream, or have a few glasses of wine, which I did at a New Year's Eve with friends. And we were talking about what we want to be when we grow up. By the way, I hope I still ask that question when I'm 80. And the idea of a cooking school came out. So I credit Elizabeth Gilbert, Big Magic, because she talks about ideas as almost little spiritual entities. We get apparently 60,000 thoughts a day. Everything from what should I have for dinner to what do I want to do next year. And those little precious entities, if you don't give birth to it, it'll go elsewhere. And La Cuisine came to me that way.
Well, I think what's the missing ingredient also for both of you is a huge amount of courage, because one of the things I like best about both of these books, there's a lot of wonderful storytelling in both of the books by two very graceful and extremely honest writers. And it's the honesty that I find really bracing, because if the three of us on stage, I think, all deeply love France, we've made our homes here, I sometimes am looking at films or television or whatever where the country is seen through a stocking cap and all of its thorns and warts go missing. There are thorns and warts, and it's important to not to pretend otherwise, because it's not easy to create a life for yourself in another country and to move into a different language and to learn a whole new set of manners and to become expert in the food ways of one of the world's 2 or 3 top gastronomic countries, and both of you have done that. Along the way, though, you must have pricked your fingers a couple of times. I mean, what happened, for example, Jane, when you first had this idea? I think that there were a lot of people who were doubtful, and you really had to work pretty hard to make this happen.
Yeah, well, sure. I came from a different industry. I didn't have experience as an entrepreneur. I am not a chef, nor have I ever trained to be, nor do I intend to be, even though I do love food. So I did have a few raised eyebrows. And, you learn things through time. And the one thing I will say is that we're all entitled to the subject of food. And we have this thing we love to do as humans is to create these little hierarchy of who's better or who has more experience. But I think food is something we all speak and we're all entitled to. So I started to embrace what my difference was. And for any of you that look around a room or an office or a community and you think I look different or I have different experience, be proud of that, because that's your secret sauce. So I finally started to embrace those things, which I hope has made my business stronger with my very proficient team that actually execute the classes. But it was an uphill battle, that's for sure.
Well, I think there was a scene in your book when you were. It was pretty grim for poor Jane when she was in that bank. I mean, there's some really, I don't know how many people have been able to read her book yet. If you haven't, you should. But anyone who's ever worked in an office in France has been in some of those situations where you're just presumed guilty because you are an English speaker and a Canadian and or an American. And you have to really work hard to get people to take you seriously, and you have to do so through the scrim of cultural difference and linguistic difference, and it's hard. I'm sure you had that experience as well, Rosa. I mean, Rosa originally was living in Le Vieux-Nice, which is that beautiful part of Nice next to the Cours Salaya, it's a little village, though, and it used to amaze me that she managed to create a place for herself. It's really like a beehive. I mean, it's so tribal. And she somehow or another managed to create a place for herself in this tribe and get people to share recipes and food ways and everything else. It's not, I mean, as a foreigner, and she's not Niçoise, and so many other things made her different, but she found a way of doing that. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I think it's a bit what Jane was saying, where we're speaking the common language of food, so that when I started going to the market and asking, I'd been a journalist, so I asked very specific questions about things, and I was drawn to certain, I was drawn to what was hidden in a way. It was like, what's under the table here that you're selling that you're not showing everybody? Because at markets, there's always good stuff under the table. And, I was lucky to meet chefs, but I think, they saw that I was, my real curiosity and how much I wanted to learn. So they were willing to share, and some of them hand wrote recipes for me. I was really touched by it. I have recipes that they wrote for me that I kept, and I also had an across the street neighbor because in Vieux-Nice, the other buildings are so close you can almost touch your neighbor. And there was an across the street neighbor called Marie who, she was one of the what we call mamie in Nice, like the grandmothers who are the keepers of the local cuisine, and she used to throw candies to my son across the street, and she started sharing recipes with me. So it was bit by bit like that. But I wouldn't say they were, to me, they were quite welcoming. Like, I didn't feel that I had to fight too much. They were definitely checking up on what I was doing. So especially when I opened my school, they wanted to know, like, how do you make your ratatouille? Like, they would just come by and they'd say, just tell me how you make this. And I go, okay, yes, that's all right. Because in Nice, it's really, each family has its recipes, but there are certain rules that you don't break, And once they saw that I respected their cuisine, then it was okay.
Alex, can I expand upon that? Sure. And I would love to know your opinion, but I think, again, in using your differences to your benefit, because I'm not French, I can dare to approach people in a way that's not polished. Because I'm not French, I can make mistakes in my addressing them or asking them for information that somebody might find invasive. So I've hopefully, and I still try to develop the science of using a difference to actually open a door.
Well, I think that's very powerful, Jane. I think the difference can be, yes, it can be, as you said, your secret power. I would just very briefly mention that I was, for about a year, the restaurant critic for Les Echos, which is the Wall Street Journal of France. And that was probably the most excruciating and difficult thing I've ever done in my entire life. Because the pressure on me from every angle that was imaginable, from, my brother-in-law has just opened, people, top brass, my sister-in-law has just opened a restaurant in Bordeaux, you have to go down there and give it a good review. I mean, it came from every imaginable direction. It was, trial by total fire. But, as Jane said, everything that you have to, eventually I decided I'm not going to compromise myself. I can't. I have my reputation, and I was flattered, perhaps, to be invited to do this job initially, but I'm not going to bend to keep the job if I have to bend too far. And so that was the end of that. But every one of these experiences makes for a richer occasion, even the disasters. And we were talking before we came up here tonight about the disasters in our lives, and there have been many notable. I'll give Jane and Rosa a chance to gather and just say I always remember the first major disaster for me was when I was interviewing Monsieur Androuet, who was a very famous cheesemonger. A week after I'd moved to Paris from London, believing that I spoke French, and very quickly realized that my French was sort of like it was like putting a cast iron urn on a card table. It collapsed pretty quickly. And there we were down in the basement, me and a photographer and Monsieur Androuet, and he's going on and on and on. And the three words that I did understand were chèvre, vache, and eventually brebis. And I'm thinking, what is a brebis? Oh, a sheep. Do sheep have milk? God, that's interesting. That's at the level that I was at that point, which was, almost 40 years ago. But then we're standing there looking at these little cheeses, and Monsieur Androuet, he looked like a Cistercian monk. He's a very gentle, nice-looking man. I thought he pointed at one of the cheeses and said, oh, yes. He cupped it in his hand, and he asked me to smell it, and I did. And he said, it smells like an old man's penis. And I thought, no, he didn't. I think I'm really in bad shape here. But I still blurted out with a big smile, oh, oui. And the photographer went, oh, Jesus, Alec. But this is the way it goes. I'm sure you've had similarly cringeable incidents in your lives, if you'd like to share some of them.
Okay, I don't know how...
I wanted to prime the pump. Right.
Oh, goodness. Not anything as exciting as that, Alec. But, in the life of a business anywhere, in a small business in France, I am spectacularly surprised at all the things that can go wrong. And it's, I will say, some of the most, everything from just business as usual. The mustard shortage, the problem with eggs, the problem with butter, the strikes, COVID. There's all sorts of things that go wrong, but some of the ones that are comical, which we enjoy, are, I can tell you when a family walks in, before they even open their mouths, how long they've been traveling together. I can look at them and tell, is it the beginning of the trip and everybody's happy? Is it the middle of the trip and we're a little testy? Or is it the end of the trip? So the fun things that happen with people in a kitchen, which I think a kitchen is a very emotive place. I think for a lot of us, even being in a foreign kitchen becomes like home. People really let their guards down with the things that they say to each other. And you get a couple of families with two sisters that are traveling together. There's bound to be some fun discussion passing back and forth with each other.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, both Rosa and Jane have passed tests of fire, remarkable tests of fire, because I did a food tour with Ruth Reichel and Nancy Silverton and Lori Oshoa, the food editor of the LA Times, 3 years ago, and we went to Jane's school. And in the middle of the night, I woke bolt upright and thought, oh my God, Nancy Silverton is taking a croissant making class at Jane's school. I hope it's good. She later in the day, Nancy Silverton, who no one knows who she is, lives in LA, and she's one of the most famous bakers in the United States. And she came up to me and she said, Alec, that was fantastic. I mean, the teaching was brilliant, and I learned some things that I did not know. And I said, well, gosh, that's good. And it was fantastic. It was a wonderful class. And similarly, Rosa created an experience for us last year when the same band of different travelers but same guides, we were in Marseille and then we went to Nice. And Rosa created a day in a garden on a hillside in Nice that was, as the food back came in from this very expensive food tour, it wasn't the 3-star restaurants that made people excited. It was the day that they'd spent cooking with Rosa on a farm on a hillside over Nice, and it was just spectacular. I mean, I stood back because I didn't want, since we know each other, I just thought I'll get out of the way and let her do her thing. I didn't think she needed any.
I was petrified.
Were you?
Well, let's say I didn't sleep for a few nights before that because, Ruth Reichel is coming to my cooking class and Nancy Silverton. It was, and also a group of 25 is not nothing to manage besides, well-known cooks. It's teaching 25 people is already by itself a big challenge.
Do you want to tell everybody what we cooked too? Because it was hardly this was not making brownies and ham sandwiches. This was serious cooking.
So Ruth, she contacted me before, and not directly, but she put in a request for the tourteblette sucrée, which is the sweet charred pie. So it's a specialty of Nice, and it's a dessert made with Swiss chard, raisins soaked in rum, pine nuts, and apple. And what's difficult for me about that dish is it has a very delicate pastry. So this was my nightmare, that the pastry was going to fall apart. And so I survived that. And we made pisse saladière, which is caramelized onion flatbread. We made rack of lamb. We made a tian, and all of this in a kitchen that is very dicey. Like the farmers around Nice, they're farmers. They're not, they don't have professionally equipped kitchens. So even though this was a space where, you can hold an event, it doesn't mean you could rely on the oven being the right temperature or, anything. So we're working basically with camping burners and...
You would have had no idea whatsoever. Rosa was just as even-tempered and smiling and delightful that day as she is tonight. And again, it was a remarkable experience. You should answer the same question, though, Jane. I'm sure that there have been things that have happened in the course of events that were absolutely mind-bogglingly horrible and or terrifying that you're still scarred by, or...
You know what? I think it's almost a trauma response, that it's hard to think of anything in particular. Paris has certainly been through so much in the past 5-6 years, just reflecting upon that. But then it's such a wonderful example of how brilliant this city is, as are the people in it, how strong they are. But yes, peppered along the way, we've had our fair share of fun, difficult things, which I'll, spoiler, the first year in business, I was in the wrong location. I hadn't understood the need for extraction. So what is extraction in English? Ventilation. So you can imagine a business just starting up in the first year having to realize they're not in the correct facility is quite difficult. So there's been painful and fun. So
this year, I had my worst ordeal of my entire 20 years of teaching when I found out at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday that my building was evacuated and indefinitely closed because they thought that the building next to it might collapse. And I found this out by email as I was coming home. I rushed to the building where there were journalists, there were politicians, there were all kinds of stuff going on. And it was a long 2 weeks while I waited for news as engineers checked the building. And eventually they just said, it's okay, you can go back, it's all fine, it's not going to collapse. But in that time, my world collapsed in my mind. So it was, I realized really how fragile a business can be, because if you lose your location, you can really, but having said that, I got a lot of support locally from the local newspaper, even from the mayor eventually. So I felt that something good came out of it, and that I had been, not really vocal about what I was doing, like in Nice, and suddenly a lot more people noticed because I was on TV and in the local newspapers. So in a way, it was. I don't want to say it was a good thing that happened, but something good came out of it.
Well, I think that the Niçoise are proud of you, because you've done something that nobody else thought to do. And they're very proud of their food, and you're the one who had the idea, okay, maybe people, and especially now because the Niçoise food is so modern. I mean, it's ancient, but it's very modern because it's the way that we like to eat, with lots of many vegetable dishes and things like that. I would like to also, now that because you've been here for almost as long, I think you're
30 years.
Yeah, I know, we've been here
10 years
forever.
in Paris.
There were glaciers on the
20
ground when I moved to Paris. And Jane, you've been here for?
it's coming up to 20 years now.
Wow, gosh.
Yeah.
So it's like the three pyramids in Giza. What do you, one of the things that fascinates me, even sitting and waiting for the bus tonight to come over here, I was looking at Paris and I thought, Jesus, this city is beautiful. How many times a day can I think that? Sometimes people say to me impatiently, my late mother was pretty famous for it, well, haven't you done enough of that? When are you going to come back? And I said, I have no idea. I never said I doubt I will. This is my home now, and I think it's your home, both home for both of you too. And, home is so deep. I was moved by what Rosa said about the way that the Niçoise reacted to her, because that was a shocking thing. Her school is in a beautiful building up on a hillside overlooking the Nice now, in a very handsome building. And they'd built a luxury hotel behind it that had apparently shifted some of the ground and stuff. But everybody came forward, and it shows you in the same way that I spend my time now between Paris and a village and between Nîmes and Avignon. And every morning, every time I go into the post office, the lady looks up and she goes, bonjour, notre américain. And I always think to myself, this is such a funny thing, because it's, yes, I am your American. I'm theirs because, as the mayor always says, we're very proud that you're here. But it's also the difference is still remarked upon. I would rather, my passport is not terribly interesting to me, less so right at this particular moment than it's been a long time. But France is home, and, it's home for you as well. warts and all, I mean, how, if the fantasy, when Rosa was talking, that's such a charming story about those cookies in the snow in Canada and the palm trees, we've all had fantasies. Many of us had fantasies before we came to live here. I mean, I followed a very similar fantasy to Rosa, because I had a book about two little children who lived in Nice, which I read so many times in a row that my father finally took it away from me. Because I was reading about mimosa and les petits farcis and all kinds of things that made me want to come and live in France. Converting the fantasy into your daily reality is a huge process. What are some of the things? I mean, it's home now. So once it's home, you can criticize home, and there are things that you love about it, and there are things that are frustrating. Do either of you have anything you want to say to address that? Because there's a huge industry around the idea that Paris is paradise on earth, that France is, when good Americans die, they go to Paris rather than go to heaven. I think Canadians get a pass because they just are nicer people and they get in straight away. But is there, this conversion of fantasy into reality, is there anything there, which you both touch upon very beautifully in your books, is there anything that you'd like to speak to in terms of that theme?
It's too sunny in Nice.
It's okay, complaining.
I know, I'm joking, but Nice, it's a funny place because people move there for the sun, and then we really do complain as soon as there's a day where it's not sunny, and so there's, it attracts a certain kind of person that moves there for the sun, and so it can be quite quirky, in the type of people who live there. Interesting, international community. It's a very nice place to meet people from all over the world. I find not many people work. It's, when you're in Nice, you're nobody really has normal office hours. So, and it's when do they ever work? But, it's a lot based around tourism. So because it is a tourism economy, it's a bit different. There's maybe, you could say, less cultural stuff going on. Although I find with Nice, you can always find things. You just need to seek them out a little bit more than in Paris. So, you could complain about things, but we live in, every day when we live in Nice, we have the sea and the sun, and we don't, it would be churlish.
Well, Jane has the sun.
I do have the sun. I will say that, I arrived here under different circumstances. It was for a business opportunity. I was not enchanted with Paris. Don't throw things at me, please. It was not my favorite city. And I've come to love Paris. And like you said, Alec, when you know something intimately, and I'm still learning, but when you know something intimately, you can recognize the blemishes and still appreciate them. And albeit I'm an only child, but Paris, to me, has been the equivalent of a very mean older sister.
That's really well put.
That sometimes...
She's a writer, I think.
That sometimes I feel, I'm accepted, and I fit in. And then the next day, no, you don't. But we have a love-hate relationship. She's been tough on me, and I'm tough on her. But I think we still love and appreciate each other.
Well, I think all of us feel that way. But I just love the honesty in their storytelling, because the frosting or the sugar icing version of Paris that's served up over and over and over again, it exasperates me, because, and that's just not true. And, there were some lonely, difficult times when I first moved here. I didn't know anyone, and I had taken a job in a business that I didn't know anything about. I was here as an exile because I had visa problems in England, and the idea was that I would wait it out here and then go back and get my job back at a newspaper in London. Until one day I decided, when the English papers came through, I thought, I don't want to live in London again. I'm very happy here, so I stayed. But there were all kinds of things, and I think the language and everything else. But also the other thing that I wonder about is, as women in French society, foreign business owners, I mean, there must have been challenges along the way there too. I mean, from your point of view, how has the landscape changed in terms of, I mean, is France still a sexist country? Is it sexist compared to English-speaking countries? Are there particular challenges being female business owners in France that might not exist in other places? Do either of you have anything you want to say there?
When I got my space where I teach cooking in Nice, it was quite a difficult process. The space is owned by the city of Nice, and I had to go and basically present my project to them. And I felt that being a woman was not an advantage, and they actually didn't give it to me the first time around. They gave it to a man, and but I waited it out because I suspected his project wasn't going to work, and so I waited for a full year until he closed, and then I tried again. And that time they accepted me. So, you can never really know why decisions are made. And I can't compare it to another country because I haven't had that experience. But it did feel like I wasn't being listened to when I presented my project the first time.
It's very hard for me to have a comparison because I've spent so much time here, and my only entrepreneurial experiences in France. But what I will say, I feel like my biggest challenge has been the perception around, do I have expertise to operate in this field? And we do know that one thing France does so well is their reverence for experts in their domains. So
especially all things culinary.
Absolutely. So I think that was my biggest challenge. But again, when people appreciate your love and respect for what they do, I have found them incredibly warm and welcoming and supportive and ready to help. So I think that was actually my bigger challenge than being female, which there certainly could have been an element of that.
And I do think things have changed for the better. In Nice, there are a lot of businesses now run by women and who support each other. So I've had some really nice contact with other women business owners, and we help publicize each other.
Fantastic. Now let's talk about the excruciating activity that was required to produce these lovely books on the table here. The nightmarish work that's known as writing.
Yes.
What made you decide you wanted to do the book, Jane?
So I seem to have every big revelation during a crisis point. And the book came out during COVID. Well, the work of the book came out as a result of COVID. I did have a book in mind that I thought I would love to write a book about starting a business in France. And those that were dear to me were kind enough to tell me, no one's going to buy that book. But somebody might buy a book about your experience starting a business in France. And so COVID came, and I had a bit of time on my hands, about 18 months of time on my hands to refocus. So I decided that I wanted to share a story that we all have, and mine just happens to take place in Paris. And yes, it's a memoir, but it's a story of personal transformation, of falling down and getting up. And that's a story we all share. So I think COVID prompted me to just kind of put it in words in this book that Jessie, actually, who's based here in Paris, designed the cover for. I wanted to mention her.
Jessie
Canellos Weiner.
Right, who's often been in this room. And for anyone who doesn't know her, she's a hugely talented illustrator who works for everyone in France and in the U.S. She's originally from Chicago, isn't she? Yeah. Well, you make it sound so easy, Jane.
I will say that writing is a horrible process. It's a horrible process. It really challenged me. I realized my attention span is very short. I needed help writing. I asked a friend to help be a writing coach because I would write something that I thought was so beautiful and eloquent, and I'd go back and read it, and there was no verb, and the noun was missing, and it sounded as though I didn't know what I was saying. But so I'm.
That's when you stop using the drugs.
That's when I stopped using the drugs. But writing is a horribly beautiful, challenging process.
I guess that's true. It's hard. I've done a lot of it. So has Rosa. What about you, Rosa? What was the? How did your book germinate and then become this beautiful reality?
I had wanted to write a book about the cuisine of southern France for a long time, and I had actually proposed it a few years ago and been refused by an agent, and so I put it aside. And then, of course, COVID happened, and I had a conversation with David Leibovitz, who many of you know of, and he said, I think it's the right time now for a regional French cookbook. It wasn't the right time before. And, for regional cookbooks in general, I think now there's more interest in that, more specific cuisines. So then I tried again with, it was actually his agent. And she was interested in my story as well. So she said, this is great, but, I don't want it just to be a cookbook. I want it to talk about you. And so she helped me flesh that out in a proposal. And then the writing, as we all know, is difficult, but I had, written in the past, so it wasn't new for me writing. I was very happy to be writing again. The only thing is I felt guilty every second I wasn't writing. So I don't know if you've had that experience. It was just
never.
I should be working on the cookbook or it won't be the best book it can be. So, if I was doing anything else, I felt bad.
Well, I think the two of you will understand when I don't feel like writing, the other thing that I do is cook. As soon as I have a deadline, a really serious deadline, I suddenly decide, I think I'll make some ratatouille.
That takes a while, so that's
right. Good. To move away from it. But I think also the storytelling is really important. I think that this is something. I think that there's a big hunger in the world right now for storytelling, and I think that both Jane and Rosa put their finger on it too. When I was starting this book, there were things that I did subjects that were still too sensitive for me to go near. And my very tough editor in New York said, stop writing around the story that everybody wants to hear. The stuff that hurts the things that are painful are the best stories, Alec. And so just bite down and go there. And that turned out to be really good advice. But I also think that there is a huge fascination with people like ourselves who have, and many of you, some of you here have certainly done the same thing, have chosen for whatever reasons to leave the country that you were born in and create a life in another country. And I take it so much for granted, but this past weekend when I was in Spain with a whole bunch of people at the Roca Brothers, these famous restaurant people in Girona, it was a whole bunch of people who'd come over from America for this weekend. And people were shocked when I said that I'd been living in France for 40 years. It was as though, and the question was always, so you don't like the United States? And I said, it's not that I don't like the United States, it's that I am so curious. And my curiosity led me to want to be on this side of the Atlantic in France, but also to travel everywhere, because that's the thing that I love as much as writing and eating, is travel. And I think, that's, Rosa also does trips. You just came back from Morocco, didn't you?
Yeah. I lead culinary tours in different countries. So I come from a family of travelers. I love being in unfamiliar situations. So that's how I've visited a lot of countries, and certain ones really, were ones I wanted to go back to again and again. And then out of that just grew the desire to bring other people with me and introduce them to people I had met in those countries.
And you, Jane? You're a traveler as well.
Yes, I am a traveler. I like a healthy mix. I must say I'm really a homebody. I know there's a couple of people in the audience that know me very well that are here. But I guess I do have an element of an explorer in me.
Well, you'd have to.
A little bit.
You moved to Paris and opened a cooking school.
Yes.
And wrote a book about it.
And I did, but I think that ultimately I seek the comfort of home as well. And that is actually what La Cuisine, I think now in hindsight, I created a space where people can come together and find comfort together over food. It's a time to commune. It's what we should do to bring us together. So even though I do love traveling, I think as I mature, I seek comfort in home.
Well, I think that it's always been true that we all speak the language of food, and that's more necessary in the world today. I mean, I think that we've all had, everyone in the room has had experiences when you've been in a place you don't speak the language, but you're hungry. And the fastest way to commune or to approach the place that you're visiting is across a bowl of soup and as Rosa said, when referring to her neighbors in the Niçoise, and Jane mentioned this too, and this is really important, and it still moves me. I worked as behind the counter at a cheesemonger in the market in Nice, or in Nîmes last summer for 2 months, because I'd become friendly with the cheesemonger, and his assistant was going away, and then the assistant's wife had a baby, and Monsieur Sylvain said to me, "Alec, would you like to come behind the counter and work with me for a little while?" And I said, "Sure, I'd be happy to do that." And I didn't think he'd actually pay me. I mean, the idea that I was going to be paid to sell French people cheese, but it was fascinating because there was, at first, it was almost like a little New Yorker cartoon of my entire life in France, because when people first came, they'd say, "You have a little teeny accent. Are you Belgian or are you Swiss?" And I'd say, "Oh, je suis Bretonien." And but the idea of and then they turned to the cheese man, and said, "What are you doing with an American behind the counter here?" But then, 2 weeks later, people would come back and say, "Mais you really know your cheese, and thank you so much for suggesting that I try X, Y, and Z." And I think that huge joy in food that we all share, as I said earlier, food, France, and the love of books and reading is a very great thing to embrace during a slightly turbulent time in history. And with that, looking toward Thanksgiving, we still have a lot to be grateful for. And I, again, can only say, before we open the floor up to questions, both of these books are absolutely beautiful, and I find them really moving. I was very moved by both of them for different reasons, for the storytelling, but also Rosa's recipes are spectacular, and they're really fantastic reads. So don't hold back. Thank you. And I think.
Thank you, Alec.
We have a hand raised already.
Thank you. Good evening. Interesting discussion. I haven't read the books, but I look forward to that. A question for Rosa and for Jane about the evolution of the pantry and what goes in your refrigerator. I haven't lived here for terribly long, but I've been back and forth for many years. And there's been a commodification of organic food production, for example, and I think a kind of industrialization of the artisanal versus traditional production and so on. I wonder if you've reflected on just the ways that what goes in your pantry, what goes in your food here in France has changed over time.
I'll talk. When I moved to Nice, I got to know some farmers, and I got to know them by name. And when I was raising my son, who was 2 when we moved to Nice, when we were eating something, I would say, "Oh, Lulu grew this," or "Pierre grew this," and so he was really. I would say you're eating not just the food, but like the person. They're putting themselves into this, and now I have to say, the market has changed. Some of those people that I originally knew 20 years ago are retired. Many have retired, or many of them work until they die. So there have been people who were old when I first met them who are no longer alive. There are not as many young farmers taking over as we would like to see. So the market has changed a lot, and we're lucky still in Nice that we find so much local produce, but things are changing, and that sort of personal touch that I can still find, I have to look for it a bit more than I used to. So I don't really know what the answer is, but I know there's still people seeking this out. So as long as there are, I hope it'll continue to exist.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd add to that, in Paris, of course, we have our markets, and you can see when you have a producer versus a reseller. So we'd rarely get to meet the farmers, but I can afford to buy organic. And I remind myself there's, the bigger question and dilemma, how do you feed a city? And the costs behind that. So, while I do love to buy fine produce and I make choices, I do understand that we constantly need to think about feeding masses and people who may not be able to afford the organic, beautiful tomatoes that I can. I don't have the answer to that, but I believe that two things can be true, and we need to provide food that everybody can afford, however it's grown. That, I think, would be my answer to that.
Another question?
This fine lady in front.
So I think you kind of alluded to this earlier, that Paris is, or France in general, is a place that a lot of people have a dream of and see through rose-colored glasses. And specifically with regards to our food system, I mean, you all are at the front lines meeting people who come here with this very dreamy vision of what French food might be. What's the biggest sort of preconceived notion that you find yourself facing when you encounter people who come here assuming something about French food that they have to face the reality about?
I have one.
Okay, you go. I'm slow on the draw tonight.
We don't eat escargot everywhere.
Yes.
So a lot of people come, especially being in Nice, which is a regional cuisine. They think French cooking is one thing, but it's actually many, many, many things. And so the dishes that you imagine being French might not exist in the place that you go to in France. And that's what I try to teach people, is that, in Nice, we're going to eat Mediterranean food. There's no butter. People in Nice grew up without butter. It's only recently that there's people use butter, and not for cooking. It's still not for cooking, but for other things. But so it's French cuisine is much, much more than people think it is.
Yeah, I would say certainly the diversity of the cuisine people don't anticipate. I'm my little ecosystem. It's a very tough balance of wanting to meet people's needs and expectations and dreams that they have in their head that they maybe don't even vocalize. But they're often disappointed they're excited but disappointed when you talk about seasonality and regionality. So I do have people who are very disappointed that, no, we probably are not going to make a French onion soup in August. Or that French people don't have foie gras and champagne every day. Wouldn't that be nice? So it's trying to meet expectations and also show little insights to what it does mean to eat in France and how we respect the products, and the timeline of those products is for the product. It's not for us to decide.
I think that your previous question, though, is a very good question, because it's almost as though this is a battlefield subject. I mean, I say to people, every time you go food shopping, it's like voting. I mean, everything that you buy is a vote in favor of or against something else. And it's an upstairs, downstairs situation in France. Most of the French people buy their food at Grande Surface, the huge supermarkets, and they shop once a week. They're busy and they're very price conscious, and that's, it's a luxury to go to the open air markets. It's more true in the country that people do that, but France is pretty much a suburban country like most of North America is now, and the huge industrial companies that are really the bandits, the evil bandits in the story, and I'm specifically thinking about cheeses, because there's a lot of pressure on the dairy, French dairy, for example. I mean, the Camembert, when I first moved here, a lot of the Camembert brands, they were all still made with raw milk, and they were affordable, and there were little differences, and you learned what the little differences were. Now you have to read really carefully, because a lot of the time it's not raw milk, it's pasteurized. It might not even be French milk, and it could be tamisé, which is sort of slightly heated, which means that it's killed off half of the bacteria that would cause the cheese to ripen and also give it its flavor. It's a battle, and I think that France is, fortunately, there's a very vivid, loud French food loving community that is pushing back, and they feel that it's so important that this is a subject that is taught in schools. I mean, children learn a lot about food at school here, and the food that they eat in the schools is really good too. I mean, they attach great importance. I mean, when I look at what's fed to children in American schools, it's just pretty much fast food. And here they still eat properly cooked, real, nutritious food, and they talk about it in classrooms. I've been in classrooms when they talk about it. And they now have two vegetarian meals a week in French schools. So it's those huge economic pressures are grinding away in France like they're grinding away in Canada or the United States. I'm a little more optimistic than I might have been 10 years ago, because I think there's an enormous pushback here, and I think that even the supermarkets here are understanding that people will walk by that food now. I mean, they don't want out-of-season produce from Morocco and Spain. They really want to buy something that's local and what have you. So that, for example, Carrefour, one of the big French supermarket chains, is reconfiguring its buying policies so that their regional buying offices, which is a big breakthrough, so that local farmers can now go to somebody within a driving distance and sell their produce to local supermarkets. So I'm guardedly optimistic, but it's also something where we have to be hugely alert and just really vigilant.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I have written in the United States about the intersection of food and the environment and climate. And I'm very curious, to Rosa in particular, but it's also reaching us here in Paris. Are the farmers already talking about, we see all these stories about devastation in the South, and are they planning ahead? Are they looking at the next 5-10 years even, how they're going to grow differently and how we're going to eat differently?
I don't know. I know that they've told me about farming has always been unpredictable, so it's it's worse now than it has been. Most of the farms in the region that I'm in are higher up, so they're on terraced slopes, which makes it very difficult to transform anything. They can only really do what they've always done, which is the charm of it in a way for me. But it's it's especially challenging farming in those circumstances where if they have floods, then the terraces could just collapse. And so that's one of the reasons I think that some people are choosing not to continue with farming, and some of the younger generation is deciding to go to the cities. But what tends to happen is the younger generation leaves and then they come back, and they miss being up on their farm and looking out at the view and seeing the sea in the distance, and so no city is going to compensate for that. So in the end, like Alec, I'm hopeful that I don't know what the solutions are, and I don't know if they've thought of solutions, but that there's still people that will want to do this.